I very much look forward to this panel and the discussions at hand, talking about using traditional financial tools, how to innovate financial and economic systems for sustainability here. Lars, I'm going to turn it over to you and welcome you all. Thank you so much in advance here.
Great. Thank you. What a great day, huh? We have heard a lot of interesting presentations. We've heard about public policy. We've heard about really exciting innovations, cool companies that we've heard about. So to wrap up the day, let's talk about the financing that we need to get some of these solutions commercialized and scaled such that they can have real impact. Now, private equity sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap, but how can we use it for the good of the world? So we'll also talk to the panel a bit about what they've seen as recent developments in this area and things that they think we might need as innovations in this field going forward. I'll introduce this fabulous panel in a second. Briefly first about me. My name is Lars Johansson. Since leaving Microsoft about 15 years ago, I've been an active angel investor and also helping build an organization called E8. Sounds funny maybe, but it was originally Element 8. We just shortened it. So what is E8? E8 is actually the first angel network in North America focused exclusively on clean tech, although we didn't even call it clean tech at that point. But we invest in companies in energy, sustainability, even some water and agriculture type companies. So this organization has grown into now also the biggest such organization in the US, based here. As of the board meeting this week, we learned that we have now 138 members. Most of them are located here, including Dana Robinson, my fellow board member, in the back of the room, and several other members are here as well. But we also have members spread out over the US. We have members in Texas, California, East Coast. We even have members in the UK, Singapore, and I think we even counted one in Saudi Arabia recently. So this group has invested over the years about $50 million in over 120 companies. That includes local heroes, and I'm going to take the opportunity to mention just a few that you may or may not have heard. Actually, how many have heard about a company called Group 14? You don't count, Dana. Almost. Okay, so I'll take a few minutes just to indulge you, because yesterday somebody said you can't be an investor and not brag about some of your companies. So last week, or maybe the week before, Group 14 announced a $400 million investment led by Porsche and several other prominent investors. This is a company, predecessor of which some of us actually led the first investment in. Now, what does Group 14 do? They make a silicon carbon nanostructured material that goes into lithium-ion batteries, replaces the existing so-called anode material. One of their customers saw a 25% increase in energy density, how much energy can be stored in these batteries by just replacing these. Think about that, 25% more energy in their batteries. It also improves the power density, how quickly you can get the energy in and out of those batteries. Another client, StoreDot, believes they can get EV charging down to 10, possibly even 5 minutes with this technology, swapping out these materials. Their first factory is in Maltby, and they're now, this $400 million round, including with some debt financing, they're looking to build out additional factories. Just in your backyard, didn't know that. Another company that you may want to look up is Level 10. Think of that as a marketplace for PPAs that make it possible for solar and wind energy projects to get into the ground. They recently got investment from International Continental Exchange, owners of, among other things, New York Stock Exchange. I could go on. I'll just briefly mention, because we've heard about fish farming and other things before, we also invest in things like Beta Hatch. They grow mealworms. Will take a while before we have that in our reception, but the fish love it, and poultry love it, so it's really helping the sustainable future that way. So that's what we do as an angel network. But even though we have many strong companies here, we invest all over US and Canada. And we have also branched out. We have 2 venture funds spun out of this network that operates like normal venture firms. I'm co-founder and managing director of both of those. Last one is about to start operations here in the next couple of months. And we have a philanthropic fund so that people can donate money into a fund that in turn also invests in similar projects. If you'd like to learn more about it, of course, I have to plug that and say, please go to e8angels.com and you can learn more about us. If you're interested in joining in some form or another, let us know. But I'm now overdue in quickly introducing the panel. First, we have Valdimarsson, who is a managing director of the venture arm of Eyrir, long experience in the VC side of things, and prior to that with Eyrir Invest. You might not think that Birger, Steen, needs an introduction, but for this panel I think it's important to point out that Birger is a partner with Summa Equity, a private equity firm. And again, private equity sometimes get accused of loading companies up with debt and maybe not focusing on sustainability. But Eyrir, the founder of Summa, really wanted to focus on a more sustainable model. It was even written up in Harvard Business Review, I believe. So very relevant. And then we have Jens Molbak, who has started a nonprofit called it's called a human benefit nonprofit that we'll hear more about in a second. And you may also be familiar with him from Molbak Nurseries. Some green projects might have taken place with purchases from there recently. And last but certainly not least, Jim Brisimitzis has founded 5G Open Innovation Labs, also with a lot of background and experience in retail and entrepreneurship and channels and so forth. So I'm going to get the discussion started, I thought, with some questions, but please think about questions. We're going to try to have hopefully as much time as possible for questions from the audience. So please think about that as we go along. We won't open the bar until we have at least 5 questions. And you can't ask when the bar's going to open. So think about that. So, but maybe to get us started, Ern, you've been in the venture field for a long time. And to me, at least, and I assume to all of us, it's been really gratifying to see the huge interest that we've seen just in the last 2-3 years in the climate tech, clean tech sector from venture. Do you see that driven largely from the limited partners, the investors in the venture funds? Or do you see that more as the VCs are finally seeing this as an opportunity? And do you think it's going to change? Is this pendulum going to swing away, or is it sustainable, so to speak?
Well, that's a good question, Lars. Thank you. And yeah, I've been in VC for a long time. It certainly feels that way sometimes. But no, as you rightly point out, VC is in the business of taking risks, and that very much includes identifying opportunities as early on as possible. The right companies and the right entrepreneurs to achieve those results. And I think what has been happening in the past few years is, well, big problems like climate issues clearly are, often need big solutions. And if you can identify big solutions or help find the solutions to the big problems, you quite often get good returns. And that is what the VCs have identified in climate opportunities, if I may say so, dealing with those big issues. And if I put it into the context of Eyrir, which relates a little bit to what you talked about yourself earlier, Eyrir has been doing VC investments for over 20 years. And we have always believed that the best investments are in companies and people who are striving to do good, to make the world a better place. And so that's something that come to us long before the buzzwords of today were coined initially. So, and the reason for this is because this is just a strong driver for people, for the companies, for the entrepreneurs, employers, and customers in many cases. This is something that helps them go the extra mile to actually achieve the success we are all looking for. As for the LPs, I think we have to admit that their interest in this investment themes has initially been driven by regulation and policy. But I also believe that lately or today, the LPs are seeing this as we, the VCs, are seeing it. These are big opportunities because these are big problems that we're trying to solve.
Good. So, Birger, can you tell us a bit more about Summa and the slightly different take that they have on the whole PE model? What drove that, and how do you see that playing out, and do you see that being adopted by more firms?
Yeah, I think it's actually very similar to what Örn just described. But as you mentioned, when our founder, Rainer, started up, he'd been in private equity for a good part of a decade, or better part of a decade, and he was questioning exactly the point you were questioning, which is, buying a company and doing some financial engineering and perhaps cutting some costs and then selling it on to the next person. There's actually studies that shows that does create value, but it's not something that's. Yeah, I think I need a little help from someone there then. It's not something that you feel very excited talking to your kids or grandkids about when they ask you, what have you done at work today? I've fired some people and I changed some numbers and I called a banker and then I sold the company and man, we're going to go to the Maldives. Don't you think that's cool? And it's not something that's very inspirational. So anyway, I went back and says, how can I be part of the solution to a number of these large sort of megatrend-driven issues that the world is facing, as opposed to part of the problem? And the theory then, which turned out to work pretty well in practice, was, you can actually you can stretch for making traditional private equity investments, what's known as a buyout fund that typically invests something like 20, 30, 40, 50, and up to maybe a couple $100 million. And you can invest in companies that either have a positive impact on society and help them grow, or you can invest in companies that have a mixed impact on society and you can help turn that impact from brown to green, as it were. We just listened to a very inspirational story by Neste about that. And that we raised our first fund back in 2016. That was for 50 million euros. Another one 2 years later at 650, and then we just raised one at 2.3 billion euros. So about 3.5 billion euros in the management now, and performance has been consistently in the top decile of private equity firms. And we've had some very, very, invested in some very good companies that have demonstrably done a lot of good. I mean, Norsk Gjenvinning is the leader in waste management in Norway. In the case of that company, waste management used to be a pretty dirty business in both senses of the word, in the sense that, there would be quite a bit of runoff from your processing, and you wouldn't necessarily care too much about that, where it ended up, and also it was quite a corrupt business. What we did was we made sure we had our own matters in order, and then we went up to the authorities and said, look, you guys better regulate this business a little better. So the RFPs that you put out, you make sure that they're proper safeguards against corruption. You better make sure that you buy from companies that do these things in the right way. And what happens then, of course, when the regulation comes in place, is that the company's got this stuff in order, gets to win more often and makes more money. And that model has turned out to work surprisingly well. So I think people thought it was a bit of a crazy idea, vulture capitalists, they're trying to do good, and it's turned out to work very well. And back to Örn's point, most of our investors, at least a goodly part of our investors, are LPs, as we call them. They weren't looking for impact. They came for the profit, but the money they put in funded impact. Right. That's our model in brief.
Great. Well, that's very encouraging to hear. So moving to Jens, can you tell us a bit more about your organization and the tri-sector approach that you have, which sounds very interesting.
I get to represent the nonprofit sector on the panel. So just some quick background. My parents immigrated to Seattle from Denmark in 1950. Dad had been an exchange student here in 48 after the war. I went back and married Mom, and my 3 sisters and I were born and raised here. And it was super important to Mom and Dad that we both had one foot rooted in American values and the other foot rooted in Nordic, Danish values. So in the 50s, they really saw, the U.S. as a symbol of, great government, good government, and freedom and democracy. That was very much a contrast to the Nazi occupation. And they also were really interested in what they called the free enterprise system and the idea that entrepreneurialism could thrive in the U.S. But on the Danish side, they were very much rooted in the idea of a civil society and local community engagement. And both my grandfather and my 2 great-grandfathers were super involved in the folk high school system in Denmark, and that whole sense of egalitarianism was something that we were raised with. And like good Danish parents, they made sure that we had lots of Lego around the house. We had buckets and buckets of it, right? So we had every color, every shape, every size. And unlike the modern ones that have all the instructions, it was sort of open innovation and creativity, and you could build all sorts of things. And you could build, this thing, and you could tear it back down and repurpose the blocks and do something else. And I think for the theme of this panel about financing our common future, I think this analogy of the bucket of Legos can be really helpful. And maybe we can go to the slide just for a moment. I have a few slides I'll put up here. It's
click.
Click, or click or shift, other deck. See what comes up here. So let's click on that one. So at NewImpact, we think a lot about how do we solve problems at scale faster. We've heard about lots of cool opportunities today, lots of challenges out there. You can pick your impact area, any one of the 17 SDG areas or 169 global targets. There's a whole raft of either problems or opportunities from housing, healthcare, education, transportation, the list goes on and on. And it's going to be super expensive. The World Bank and the UN have estimated anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion annually to $6 to $7 trillion annually to pay for all this stuff. And the question is, where are we going to find that money? Because there's not enough new money, there's not enough private equity and venture and investment capital in the world to make that sort of scale of innovation happen. So click. If you think about the bucket of Legos as an analogy for the world's resources, if you add up all the things we've already built, what's the balance sheet of the world, right? If you think of every resource that a company has built or a nonprofit or a government, there's really a vast abundance of resources in the world. Think about every truck, every building that a private sector company has built. Think about every database that the government has put together. Think about every trusted relationship in the nonprofit sector. When you start thinking holistically about the amount of resources in the world, there's a lot. And all of a sudden, if you look at 250 trillion spread through the US and just the Nordics alone, all of a sudden you have enough scale to think about how to solve these problems. And if you think about these resources as a bucket of Legos, maybe we can borrow a government resource here that's already been built, and a nonprofit resource there, and a company resource here, and build and assemble. So click. At NewImpact, we think about ourselves as promoting a new way of thinking. We have human-centered design. There's design thinking, agile, circular economy, lots of different ways to think about solving problems at scale. What we're adding to the conversation is this notion of tri-sector innovation and tri-sector business models. So we very much think about repurposing the existing resources that are out there, which is, both a really smart thing to do, and it preserves the new money for what you really need, but then realigning those resources in interesting ways. Super importantly, harnessing self-interest. So we think a lot about business models. So what's the self-interest of government, the self-interest of the social sector, the self-interest of a private sector company, so those resources can flow, and then for common benefit. And we found it to be a super powerful benefit. I'll give you one quick example here. Click. This is a company that I built, Coinstar. Many of you probably know the coin counting machines in supermarkets with this. It was a successful private sector company, but it was my first experience with a tri-sector model. So yes, Coinstar got a bunch of rounds of venture. We went public. It was a great deal for investors, but it was also a great deal for the U.S. government. We essentially became the national coin recycling system and brought all this loose change back in the economy, and it saved the U.S. government billions in terms of reduced manufacturing costs and distribution costs. And similarly, they helped accelerate our business model to grow internationally. We also worked super closely with the social sector. We helped raise money for the Red Cross, for UNICEF, the World Wildlife Fund, so people could donate funds at the machines, and we could cut the cost down and wire the funds right into their bank account. So it was this very synergistic model where each sector both contributed resources to and benefited from the model. So click, last slide. The message I kind of want to bring to you today in terms of financing is threefold. If you're a company, we've heard from lots of really interesting companies today, think about a tri-sector model. If you have a good business, a tri-sector model can make it better. If you have a great business, we think that it can make it even better than what it is today, because there are essentially latent resources that are laying in the different sectors that we don't think about lining up, but when you do, it can be really catalytic. So if you're a company or another organization, think about a tri-sector model. Secondarily, if you're an investor, if you're a VC fund or a private equity investor and you're looking for opportunities, we think this is a very powerful new investment thesis. It essentially unlocks returns that are not concessionary, they're actually catalytic when you start to line these things up, and we're harvesting inefficiencies across the sectors. So if you're an investor, get excited about this. And our job at NewImpact is to teach and train and try to get more companies to do this. And lastly, for all of us at scale, we've heard lots of really cool, exciting things today. I mean, this is a very optimistic, positive summit, which is awesome. I like that a lot. But if all of us can think much more holistically about a whole of society approach and leveraging what we already have, I think we'll find we do actually have enough resources out there to fund the sort of things we want to fund. And that's part of what we're trying to promote at NewImpact with this way of thinking. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. That's super interesting. So Jim, can you tell us about the open innovation model that you have at the lab that you founded?
Happy to. I think you've all probably talked about 5G quite a bit today, so I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I grew up in the software ecosystem. I started my career at Nortel Networks, went to PeopleSoft, Oracle, and then got a recruiting call from Microsoft in 2005 and moved up, and that's where I got to meet Birger and collaborate together. And I looked at where 5G was going, and behind the scenes, the cloud native move for 5G networks was an important pivot point, in my humble belief, for the telecommunications industry, because for the first time ever, it could really actually create a bridge into the software ecosystem. At Microsoft, I learned many lessons, one of which platforms are really important, and the ecosystem you build around the platforms are tremendously even more important than the platforms themselves. And what I realized was that for 5G, the carriers really don't have ecosystems. They sell devices, they sell services to their networks, but they have no ecosystems. And the trillions of dollars of services and online experiences and games and all the other stuff that we did in our personal lives, they saw zero for. So the 5G Open Innovation Lab was really an ecosystem approach. It's an open innovation program that draws on the CSPs, partners like Ericsson and Nokia and Microsoft and Intel, and then a host of teams that are of all stages, from early stage to later stage. We've had 5 batches over the last 2.5 years since we launched. Those teams have collectively raised just north of $1.04 billion in venture capital. We've launched our own small rolling fund ourselves. We've made some investments this last quarter. We'll be making again some investments this next quarter. We'll be announcing those in the fall. So for us, what we wanted to do is not to create a yet another startup program. What we really wanted to do was to catalyze an ecosystem and really create an opportunity for the CSPs and the ecosystem broadly that was bigger than just connectivity. In any given nation, the incumbent CSPs have more fiber miles of network cabling than any of the big hyperscalers, and yet they haven't really figured out a way how to transform their networks into platforms of value, especially when it comes to edge scenarios or the enterprise. So by bringing the carrier organizations into the mix, by bringing the big technology players like Microsoft and Intel and Dell and VMware and Ericsson and others into the mix, and startups, and then we're also very fortunate to have large enterprises who I believe are going to be the biggest benefactors of 5G, not us as consumers. Yes, our Facebook feeds will get faster. Yes, we can watch high-def videos, but that's not a moneymaker. The big moneymaker is going to be in the enterprise. And so we also have enterprises that are looking to connectivity and networks as a way to transform their businesses, and that's what we've invested in building as a program.
Great. Thank you. So I thought I'd ask some questions sort of for anybody or all of you to to address as you see fit, and then we'll go from there. And again, hope you're thinking about questions for this great panel. So I know you're sort of in different parts of the financing sector, but if we were to look at it broadly, what parts of this system do you think is working well today? And where do you see new things developing, new innovations coming, and what do you see might be needed beyond that? And could include things like, what do you think about crowdfunding? What do you think about philanthropic or models that are more focused on impact than on returns, more concessionary returns, as they say, if you don't look for the big bucks back? Does blockchain have opportunity? I'm not talking about currencies like Bitcoin, but things like, for example, again, here locally, Nordic creating tokens for verified carbon removal that can then in turn be traded, or other things. So feel free to elaborate on what you see is working well and what's needed, if that's not too open-ended.
I'll go first. One of the sectors that I'm keenly focused on learning more about is environmental impact investing. We operate 2 of our own 5G labs at farms in Snohomish County, not too far from here, and we ran some use cases with some of our startups that have had meaningful impact on the production of resources. In fact, one farm is actually watering less and has better outcomes on their crops. There's something to be said about using data and the networks and the compute that generates and processes that data to help unlock insights so that we can all be environmentally more sensible. And that's an area that I see a lot of infusion coming in. Data is such a big business. If you do some research on it, PwC did a report, I think it was last year, that published. Data itself will actually generate meaningful GDP impact, as high as 14% of GDP impact, just because of the transformative nature of what data could do in businesses today. And we all have seen a lot more businesses stepping forward in environmental impact investing. Microsoft being one of the alums that I was part of, really leading in some of those areas as well. So that's a sector that I've seen that's really transformative. And it's these networks that are out reaching the far stretches of nations around the world that are going to be the way to actually reach those data sources.
Yeah, I'd add, I get a unique vantage point that I get to go to conferences like this. I love innovation, and there's amazing things happening with companies. I will go to nonprofit conferences and hear about all the cool things that NGOs are doing, what foundations are excited about, and then I'll spend time with different governments from federal to state. And there's great innovation happening everywhere, but there's not a conference that brings them all together, because what I see is disconnected silos. So on one hand, I'm really optimistic about the level and energy of innovation, but I'm like, my God, we got to create the connective tissue or the network to actually get together, because we don't know what other folks are doing, and there's so much opportunity to put these things together if we can just start to knit it together in a little more of a collective manner.
Right.
Maybe if I could add, with I think the innovation that is most needed in the financial system in this regard is in regards to how to measure the results. I think maybe Birger kind of mentioned earlier, they got investors because they are delivering good financial returns, and the impact is something that follows. Then it's a side effect, and until we are able to have a good measurement system for the impact of impact, it's going to be difficult to get really big money into those themes. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point. Certainly resonates with some of the things that we do, because different companies, depending on which businesses they are in, might measure their impact differently. And how do you make that standardized across different entities, different platforms, so that you can have more of a uniform impact measurement, basically?
Although I've looked at a lot of these measurement things, and I think if you embed impact into the core model, it is fundamental and synonymous with the return, and so it doesn't need to be broken out. I get a little concerned that we measure profitability here and ESG or CSR over here, and I think that's a flaw in actually how the models themselves are designed. So we can have a debate about metrics, useful or not.
No, I think that's exactly the point.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. You need to be able to connect this, so you have some measurements that people agree on, are measuring what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So one way we think about it is, any economic activity, any business, it produces a number of outcomes with the resources it has at its disposal. The outcomes are either measurable in the P&L, or they're outcomes that are not measured or measurable in the P&L. Take an example, the tobacco industry. They made a lot of money for a very long time. There was an impact that was not measured in the P&L, which was there's an over-incidence of lung cancer cases and chronic obstructive lung disease and things like that. That was out here. And it didn't get measured. There's a technical term for that. It's called an externality. And if it's a negative impact that doesn't get measured, it's a negative externality. And then from the point in time when they could have measured it, because they knew about it, about 1935 or so, when the first doctor pointed it out, until they had to pay for it, which was the first payout happened in 2009. It was about 7 years. So then, if you're an investor with a shorter time horizon than 7 years, you can make a lot of money on tobacco. But then ultimately, the chicken come home to roost. The externality that you've built up over time, you have to pay it back. And it's the same thing with what the hydrocarbon industry or whatever. You build up this debt that we socially have to pay back in the case of carbon taxes or whatever we have to pay now to get back to a sustainable carbon content in the atmosphere. We think that if you manage to identify these externalities and manage them over an investment cycle, you take negative externalities out, or you put positive externalities into the profit and loss. Like you've built something good, and all of a sudden you get paid for it. Yeah. Norsk Gjenvinning that I talked about, they built a better model for waste management, and then we worked with the regulatory environment to get paid for it. Right. So that's where we think you merge those two ends. Yeah, you kind of have to think of them as separate buckets first, but your objective is that they won't be separate buckets because you'll get paid for it in the end.
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting point. As we've been pushing the thinking on a tri-sector model, we think we're actually doing, by forcing the sectors together with common interests, that we're actually embedding those externalities and we're internalizing them into the model.
Precisely, internalizing.
Yeah, and so, it's a very interesting mechanism to get the externalities recognized in that organization itself.
Great, fascinating. I am sure the audience is fascinated too, and I see Robert's ready with a mic.
Microphone.
First
Let's
question.
Start right here, and if you'd kindly say who you are.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Scar, and I just had a quick question here. Basically, venture funding, there's still a major gap between what kind of funding goes to women and men and people of color versus white people. What are you doing to even the playing field?
Great question. Thank you.
I'm happy to start with it. Kind of feels pointed my way in a sense, but it is an interesting challenge. And well, back in Iceland, where we are mostly investing in Iceland, this is mostly a gender issue. It's a very Scandinavian community with almost entirely Caucasian, but we have clearly an issue which is quite well documented with us, that we do not see a lot of female investment opportunities, and there are far too few that get funded, and we honestly don't know why it is, and we don't really know how to deal with it, to solve it. But it's very much on our minds. And in the past year or so, it's been starting to happen to me that I've had to meet great teams and great companies, and I have to tell them, look, you're 25, 30-year-old guys. I can't invest in you. It's impossible. You have a great idea, you have a great company, but I'm not going to invest in an entirely male team. That's the only thing that we can do. But I can still invest in an only female team. But also, well, I don't know how many of you were here yesterday. We were lucky enough to have a few of our companies present here yesterday, and I'm quite proud that the team that we are bringing here is approximately 50-50 male and female. And cheers. Yeah, I'm very proud of that. Yeah.
I'm not technically on the panel, but just a quick note on within E8 Angels, we've actually invested in quite a few female-led companies as well as minority-led. It's not where it needs to be. In the new venture fund, we are planning to include in our term sheets when we lead rounds. We're not going to require that it has to be a certain split when we invest, but we're going to demand that in addition to financial reporting, we get reporting on how they are progressing on their diversity goals. I'm not going to say that you're going to get to this and that, but if you report on it, if you think about it, and if it's something that you're responsible for reporting, hopefully that gets sort of in the mindset of the entrepreneurs. And Birger, you had some comment?
Yeah, I don't know, were you here this morning? Yeah. So I think a measurement and the sort of parsing through the causality of these mechanisms is quite important. Because if you start from 52% male, boys that get born, and presumably with the same distribution of skills as the girls who get born, and then you kind of, if you start from there, and then you point out that there's a different distribution somewhere later down the line, without regard to whatever funnels and filters and biases and whatever you find in the interim, you can go and act in the wrong place. And that's why we think it's important to try to get the facts behind what's really going on. And companies like Pay Analytics and Equality Check, that's what they're doing. So that they can tell you, well, if you start acting here, it's not going to help because there's something that particularly doesn't appeal to one gender in this particular industry. So it doesn't matter how many you educate because you're not going to go in there anyway. So you really need to think about this in a funnel sort of view. But then investing behind companies like that who can help you get the facts and then act on them, we think is and I personally am an investor in Equality Check, here by flag. And that's one of the things that I do. And another thing is, you may know in Norway we've had for the last 16 years a rule that says 40% of women in publicly listed boards. In Summa we formulated a little bit different. We said maximum 60% of one gender, so that we're a little bit more open for other definitions and things. One of the mechanisms that I'm supporting in Norway to help with this is a company called Styrelisten, which is a non-profit, and we're pre-qualified, pre-vetted, peer-reviewed now more than 500 non-men who are available for public sector or private sector, private equity or otherwise board work. So you can start building that base of experience that eventually is going to turn people into entrepreneurs or CEOs or whatever you might have.
And I'm back here, and we have time for one more question from the audience to stay on time here. If you'd be so kind as to say your name.
Lars Johansson, and I'm Stellan Holdings, a company here in Seattle, but with operations in Sweden. And I must first say to the organizers here, you have done a fantastic job. I think this conference has been the best of all the summits I have been attending here. But, and you have covered a lot of space here, everything from sustainability to high tech, and also sort of how do we afford to pay for all this we want to do here in the future. And one issue we have here that I don't feel have been perhaps covered as much as it has, or perhaps needs to be covered, and might be a topic for next year's conference, or at least be part of it, is how can normal people afford to live with all the needs that we have to consider. Building sustainable cities cost money to make them last for long, but also to be green and lower the CO2 emissions. And can we create enough good paying jobs to pay for that? Or are there people that are left behind here? And with Sweden and the Nordic countries on one side and the US on the other side, that operates with a little bit of a different systems, how you look at these things and who pays for what. What is there to be learned between our area here and the Nordic countries? Is there anything that can be discussed next year to see how we can sort of learn from each other. Because there's no doubt that the world is in for a change here. We have been used to free money for a long period of time. Now we see inflation coming. We also see that interest rates are going to come up, and costs for money will go up. And how can, from my sector in building homes and houses, or rather apartments for working people, how can they afford to live with in better buildings that do not emit CO2 or meet the requirements?
Do we have any reflection, a reflection on that comment? Any of you? Who dares to be so bold as to respond?
Well, Robert, an answer as a part organizer, part panel member, but the notion that the Nordics have been or are a sort of relatively compressed social democrat, maybe even socialist, some people would think, society where everybody has it relatively well, but it's very hard to sort of do something out of the ordinary. I think that's one we might explore next year, because it turns out that, yeah, and if you measure the Gini coefficient, which is typically a way to go after inequality, yes, the Nordic countries are probably the least unequal on the planet, although they're getting a little bit more unequal. But if you measure social mobility, that's where the surprise comes, because I think they're all well above the US now in terms of the ability for somebody to get born into nothing in particular and then do spectacularly well. So there's something about the stories we tell ourselves about the places we live where reality has outpaced narrative a little bit. And maybe that's something we should pick back up.
I was just going to...
Also with the trend... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I share a lot of your concerns. And when I think about how to spend my time, if we want to drive societal progress, economic progress, social progress, environmental progress, there's a whole bunch of things that got to happen. And if we're going to do it in a way that makes sense for people, we got to change how we're doing this stuff so that it actually is affordable and just and those things. And I'll just say from a personal note, the reason I'm not running a company or fund is I think that that's exactly the issue we got to focus on and make happen. We don't have all the answers figured out on that yet, but as a society, we got to get there, or I'm concerned.
I think it's an important point that Lars are raising, and they're also exacerbated by the transition that's going to need to happen from the traditional ways that we've been doing things, not just in the fuels industry, but in a lot of sectors. So opportunities there for retraining. We actually saw, and many invested recently in a company called Terra.do that does a lot of training, online classes, forums for people. Anybody can actually go on there and take a class on something you find interesting. So I definitely see that as a serious concern.
Please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you so very much. And if you'd kindly stay, and if you good folks, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Birger, you're going to have the final word here. I believe that I get to say one final thing here.
Please.
And I appreciate the question from the gentleman back there. And this is also where I find that the students at the University of California, Berkeley, that I have the privilege to lead on study tours of the Nordics, are fascinated at the Nordic model to see what can we learn from the Nordic model. And when we talk about innovations, not just services and goods, but innovations in public policy that possibly we could learn. And I think I am fascinated in the idea of freedom and these narratives of land of the free and American dream. How do we actually realize these? There's some evidence to say that just as much as the Nordics can learn from the US, we can definitely learn from the Nordics. And when we talk about social mobility, for all the flaws that the Nordics have, because there is no utopia on this planet, but when the World Economic Forum measured social mobility and came out with its 2020 report, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the world for social mobility, up or down, Nordic countries. United States, number 28. And this has been deemed the American Dream Index. And I think there's something very interesting for us to tee up narratives of the American dream and the land of the free and reinvigorate them and say, here in the United States, how do we ensure that the American dream is a reality for everyone. And so the word that I just want to say, Jens, I'm going to pick up on, you mentioned folk schools. And so I just want to offer just a reflection at the end of this day. And it relates to folk schools, and it relates to philosophy and a mindset. Because I just sense a mindset when we talk about Nordic innovation and when we step back and talk about Nordic societies. And so when you talk about folk schools in Denmark, that brings us to Grundtvig, of course, that great philosopher that when President Barack Obama hosted all the heads of state of the Nordic nations in D.C., Obama referred to that great philosopher from the north, and he talked about folk schools, Obama did, and this idea of Bildung. And Bildung, German word, but incorporated in folk schools, the idea of take personal responsibility and take responsibility for society and keep on expanding your responsibilities into the world, global responsibilities. That is the concept that the students that I have that we led over to Copenhagen this last few weeks ago, they were fascinated by it. They're hungry for it. Folks recognize that we have some real problems in this world, but they want to tackle them. And this idea of Bildung and folk schools, education for everyone, the peasant education. There's something very beautiful there that's also very modern. Taking on responsibilities and then innovating to address them. So I just want to leave with that connection of the mindset, the philosophy of the Nordics that very much resonates so much when we talk about openness, sustainability, social justice, and innovation. The values of the National Nordic Museum here that are reflections of the Nordics. I think that that is so incredibly special. And before we rush to talk about the goods and the services that we're producing and how we innovate them, as important as it is, let's also take a step back and look at the underlying philosophy and the mindset that produced them. So I'll leave the final words to you, Birger. And I'll remind you also, you're the only thing standing in between us and some beer.
It's very hard to improve on Robert when it comes to waxing lyrical about the Nordics. I won't try. I'll just note that I think in the input we've gotten from the audience in this last session, including Robert, we have a good starting point for the program committee for next year's Nordic Innovation Summit, as well as for the Nordic Innovation Series, which is going to continue throughout this year with smaller sort of bite-sized events and content. This is now an institution. It will go on. You will be welcome back approximately this time next year. And we'll pick up the thread with some of the topics that we just started discussing. So look forward to seeing you all back then. And then I think it's time for some refreshments.
All right.
Thank you.